Washington was our first president. And the question is, was he really? So let's talk about some men who were actually presidents before George Washington. Well, let me put it this way. When I'm done, you can make up your own mind. Now, first of all, what happened was the American Revolution. And obviously, we're not going to do the whole revolution today, but there were a number of things that happened. And one of the most important was something where Parliament passed something called the Coercive Acts. And they were 5 acts that people were really angry about. And here in the colonies, we called them the Intolerable Acts. And as a result of that, people were really furious. Now, one of those things later was a limitation on the importation of tea. And what you see here is a political cartoon. And this was drawn by none other than Paul Revere. Now, you all know, listen, my children, you shall hear the midnight ride. Well, Paul, he didn't ride that much, but he was a wonderful artist. And he drew this political cartoon, and it's the British customs man pouring tea down the throat of America. Now, when we began the country, our first national symbol was a woman. Now, believe it or not, women were second-class citizens. Women couldn't own property. As you know, of course, it took many years for women to get the vote. Nevertheless, our national symbol was known as Columbia. And the tax man is pouring the tea down the throat of Columbia, which stands for the United Colonies. And here she is. She's at the top of the Capitol building. So when they built the Capitol, they put Columbia, a woman, on top. Now, what happened was, as a result of these coercive acts and other acts, Congress got together in Philadelphia, and the first Congress met at Carpenter's Hall. And, of course, they wanted to show their opposition to the king. So when they created Congress, they said, well, we need a president. So this is Peyton Randolph of Virginia. He was the first president of Congress assembled. So the first time all the 13 colonies got together as one unified group, they elected Peyton Randolph of Virginia. Now, many people will tell you, well, it's clear then that Peyton Randolph is our first president. Well, then comes something called the Declaration of Independence in 1776. And what do you think? This is the Dunlop broadside of the Declaration, and there's only one name on it. And what does it say? John Hancock, President. What? Yes, he was president at that time of Congress assembled, meaning all the states together. Now, in those days, they had term limits for the president. You ready for this? 1 year. That was it. 1 year, and you moved on, and somebody else took over. So there were numerous other men during this early period who served as president of the colonies assembled, as they called it. John Jay, Thomas McKean, Henry Laurens, and a number of others. Now, what happened then is we adopted our first Constitution. Now, some of you may remember from school, it was called the Articles of Confederation. That's really the first time they put together rules for how the colonies are going to live together. And in those rules, they said, well, we need a president of our colonies. And they elected a guy from Maryland by the name of John Hanson. Now, if you go to Annapolis, I have cousins that live in Annapolis, and we visited them last year, and they took us to the State House. And guess what? There's a huge exhibit about John Hanson, the first president of the United States. Now, he was the first president under the Articles of Confederation, which was our first Constitution. And again, since presidents were only for 1 year, number of other men, Patrick Henry and Richard Henry Lee and Thomas Mifflin, all served as president of the Congress assembled or of the colonies. And what did those presidents do? They did the same thing that every president would do. They signed laws, they adjourned Congress, they signed military commissions. They did all kinds of important things. So now what happens? Well, September 3rd, 1783, we signed something with England called the Treaty of Paris. And what does that do? That makes us a free and independent country. The Revolutionary War was now over. You know, the Revolutionary War was 8 years long. From April 1775 to September 1783. Now, these are the delegates, the American delegates, and that's John Trumbull's famous painting. And the gentleman, by the way, I thought it's interesting to point out, the guy with his hand like this, you know, holding his head up, that is William Temple Franklin. He is the grandson of Benjamin Franklin. He was the secretary of the commission. And notice how it's not finished. Because they went to the British representatives and say, okay, gentlemen, your turn, have a seat. And they said, no, we're not doing that. And they never sat, and that is the completed painting. That's actually the completed painting. That's when we became officially an independent country. Now, at that time, the man who was president is Elias Boudinot of New Jersey. And many people in New Jersey, there's actually an exhibit in Trenton that says that when we officially became a country, the president was Elias Boudinot. He is the first president of the United States. Well, that's a good question, because then 1787, we redid the Constitution. We wrote the one that we have now. And in those days, of course, what the Founding Fathers said, by the way, is very insulting. They said, you know what? We, the people, you're not smart enough to elect the president. We'll do it. And that's how you get the Electoral College. Because they didn't count popular votes. They counted only electoral votes. So on February 4th, 1789, George Washington got all the electoral votes, and he became the first president under this new Constitution. Now, what else did the Founding Fathers say? You're going to love this one. They said there should be no political parties. So the way this is going to work is as follows. The man who gets, notice it's the man, sorry ladies. But it's the man who gets the most electoral votes will be president. The man who gets the second most electoral votes will be vice president. So there's no political parties. Now that lasted about 10 minutes. Because John Adams and Alexander Hamilton formed the Federalist Party, and Thomas Jefferson and a guy named Aaron Burr, they formed the Democratic Republican Party. So immediately things split up. But John Adams in the first election, got the second most electoral votes, and he became then the vice president. So, by 1789, Washington and Adams had created the Federalist Party, and Madison and Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr had created the Democratic Republican Party. So, Washington clearly was president under the new Constitution. But now, I leave it to you to think this through. The first time the colonies all came together as one assembled group, they elected Peyton Randolph. Maybe he should be considered our first president. Of course, when we declared our independence, who was president? John Hancock. It says it right there. And then, of course, with our first Constitution, the Congress elected John Hanson. And then, of course, there's Elias Boudinot. He was president when we actually became a free and independent country. And then some of you will still think it's George. However, I leave it to you to think it through as to who really is our first president. Now, who's our first American-born president? The reason I put this in here is because guess what? Now, I'm glad you're all sitting down. Ready for this one? Google is wrong. How about that? You heard it here first. Now, here's what the Constitution says about being president. You've got to be a natural-born citizen. But of course, in the beginning, everybody was an English citizen. We were all British. So they said, or a citizen of the United States at the time of the adoption of the Constitution. So our first 7 presidents were born as British citizens. But under the Constitution, they were able to be president. Now, what Google says is, and again, we became an independent country on September the 3rd, 1783. That's when they signed the Treaty of Paris. That made us a country. So that's the date. Now, what Google says is, Martin Van Buren, the 8th president, is the first American-born president. And as I'm telling you, you can tell Google next time you talk to him that Google is wrong. And Herb said so. Because he was born December 5th, 1782. We were not a country yet. He was born a British citizen. Now, president number 9 was William Henry Harrison. He was clearly a British citizen. So in my view, the first American-born president was our 10th president, John Tyler. He's the first one born after we became an independent country. So now, here's President David Rice Atchison. You've all heard of him, right? You studied him in school. What? What do you mean you never heard of him? He was president of the United States for 1 day. Oh my goodness, right? Aren't you glad you stayed for this? So what happened is on March 4th, that was the day originally that the inauguration day. It wasn't in January, it was in March. So the election of 1848, the outgoing president is James K. Polk, and the vice president is George M. Dallas, and the incoming president is Zachary Taylor. Now, so remember, inauguration day is March the 4th. So on March the 2nd, George Dallas, the vice president, you know where he's from? Philly. Yes, he's a Philadelphia boy. Lived his whole life here, served in many capacities, and he became vice president. You know what he said about being vice president? Worst job in the world. Hate this job. So honest to God, on the 2nd of March, 1849, this is before the inauguration now, George Dallas says, I'm done, gets on his horse, and he rides back to Philadelphia. Now, I got to tell you something else cute about George, and you can Google this one, that there are some historians that believe that the city of Dallas, Texas, is named after George M. Dallas, which to me as an Eagles fan is so great. To have Dallas named after a guy from Philadelphia. That would be cool, wouldn't it? So, on that same day, March the 2nd, the Senate elected David Rice Atchison as President Pro Tem of the Senate. Now, in those days, the order of succession was different than it is today. It was President, Vice President, and then President of the Senate. Today, it's the Speaker of the House, but in those days, it was then President of the Senate. So he's third in line for the presidency. Now, March the 4th rolls around. 6:30 in the morning, the current president says, oh my God, I'm done. I close the books. He walks out, gets on his horse, and he goes back to Tennessee. Now, wait a minute. The vice president's gone. The president got on his horse and he left. Oh, well, the inauguration's later, so we'll get a president, right? Except no. See, Zachary Taylor was very religious, and he said March 4th falls on a Sunday. That's the Sabbath, and I will not be inaugurated on a Sunday. We'll do it on March 5th, the next day. So now what happens? March the 4th, the president has gone home. The vice president's already down at the Delaware fishing, right? Didn't inaugurate anybody. So then the presidency falls by default to David Rice Atchison. And here you see the newspaper, the president you never heard of. Now you're going to say to me, oh, come on, Herb, this is just silly. Except there it is in the newspaper, the National Intelligencer, March 10th, 1849. President for a day, the Honorable David R. Atchison of Missouri, President of the Senate, was on Sunday last, by virtue of his office, President of the United States for one day. Okay, all right. See, some of you are still looking at me funny. All right, so here is a memorial to him where he's from. And on the memorial, it says right there, David Rice Atchison, President of the United States for one day. Now, this lady here is still looking at me funny. So how about this one? This is the smallest presidential library. Atchison County Historical Museum is and there it is. There's a postage cover from the post office. David Rice Atchison, world's smallest presidential library. And this is his gravesite, and it clearly says there, President of the United States for one day. Now, Atchison, during his lifetime, he said, I never really served as president, but it's clear he was technically the president of the United States. So put him in, just slide him in there. Now, there's another story where we actually had two presidents on one day. And I saw this once myself, and I said, well, this is an interesting story. This is when Grant is succeeded by Rutherford B. Hayes. Now, what happens is, again, on March 4th falls on a Sunday. So Hayes says, instead of the day after, I'll be inaugurated the day before. So they had the inauguration on March the 3rd. The only problem is Grant liked being president. And he said, I'm not going home. And he stayed in his office the entire day of March the 4th. So Grant was there. The new president was inaugurated. Can you imagine Hayes standing on the door? Let me in! But they were technically then two presidents on one day. Well, let's look at our beloved George Washington. You remember this wonderful story? George Washington runs out and says, I chopped down the cherry tree, Daddy. I cannot tell a lie. You know that one? Yeah, it's a lie. Yeah, this never happened. It comes up in 1809 in a book called The Life of Washington by Mason Locke Weems. Now, this is 10 years after Washington's death. And what happens is he wanted to extol the virtues of Washington and patriotism, so he simply made the story up. There is no record. Washington himself never wrote about it. No member of his family ever wrote about it. There's never been any discussion about George Washington chopping down a cherry tree except in Weems' book. He also made up the story of Washington praying at Valley Forge, very famous painting. And my favorite, the Phillies. Anybody watch the Phillies here? You watch their pictures and you'd go, oy vey, it's terrible. He threw $1 over the Potomac. Remember that story? Except the Potomac's a mile wide. And I always say the Phillies could use that arm. So they call Mason Locke Weems the endearing myth maker. Everyone recognizes his histories for the fiction that they are. Now, this is one that I just want you to think about because it's really kind of an interesting story. Many people aren't aware of this. George Washington began his career as an officer in the British Army. Isn't that amazing? Washington was a British Army officer. He rose to the rank of colonel. He fired the shots that started the French and Indian War, which led to Parliament taxing the colonies, which led to our independence. And what happened is they sent him out to the West, and they told him to negotiate with the French. And here you can see that he came back and he said, the French won't negotiate. And the governor said to him, then make prisoners of or kill and destroy all those who resist British control of the region. So Washington went back, he got into a battle, he killed the commanding officer, the gentleman that you see there. That's the historic marker out. This is in western Pennsylvania. And then he went into this little fort called Fort Necessity. The French surrounded him and he had to retreat. But his actions were the spark that started the war. So now he rose to the rank of colonel in the British Army. Pretty high rank. And he requested then in 1858, I'd like to be promoted to general in the British Army. This is George Washington. The British said no, because you're a colonial officer. And our general officers must be from England. They can't be born in the colonies. And you got to pay for your commission. So they said no. So George said, okay. So he resigned his commission and he married a young, really rich woman, Martha Dandridge Custis. Now, her first husband, Daniel Parke Custis, happened to be the richest man in Virginia. So he married into great wealth and he married Martha Washington. Then, June of 1775, he becomes commander-in-chief of the new American Army. They called it the Continental Line. Now, I leave a question. Wouldn't it have been interesting? What would have happened if George Washington had become a general in the British Army? Think about that one for a minute. Isn't that interesting? It's just one of Herb's tidbits. I think it's kind of a neat, interesting story. Now, this is when we almost lost Washington. This is the invasion of Pennsylvania by the British. There's a big battle at Brandywine Creek. And there's an officer there named Patrick Ferguson. And he's a very, very smart. He's one of the more brilliant British officers. He invented a rifle that could fire a breech-loading rifle. And he had a bunch of men. Today we call them special forces. But he dressed them in green, and they were out in front of the British Army. Remember, the British Army were redcoats. They wore red. But his men wore green to camouflage themselves. So they were out ahead of the army. It's Brandywine Creek. These men, there's about 20 of them, and they're spread out, and they're marching, they're going through the woods to see what's ahead of them. And out rides two officers. Now, this is a painting that was done, and I know it's hard to see him. I put a blue arrow there. That's Captain Ferguson. He was a captain then. He's in green. You see how he's kind of camouflaged? I don't know if you can see that well. But there's an officer there. And he figures, oh, I can capture him. So he runs out, and he says, halt, halt. What does the officer do? Turns around, tips his cap, turns his back, and rides off. That was George Washington. Now, why did it happen to Ferguson? He saw him. He didn't shoot him. Because what he said later was this: I could have lodged half a dozen balls in or about him before he was out of my reach. But it was not pleasant to fire at the back of an unoffending individual who was acquitting himself very coolly of his duty, so I let him alone. Can you imagine if Ferguson wasn't such a nice guy? He would have shot George Washington, the Battle of Brandywine. Okay, what kind of teeth did Washington have? Come on. Wooden teeth. Yeah, this young lady said it. Wooden teeth. I hate to tell you, but that's also a story. Now, Washington had dental troubles his whole life. Most people did. There was no fluoride. They didn't brush. A lot of people had dental issues, but certainly Washington had bad ones. His teeth were rotten and everything. But he never had wooden teeth. Now, we do not know where that story comes from. That's just a story that grew up over time. Nobody knows where it started. We honestly don't know. But these are from Washington's Mount Vernon. This is in the museum there, and those are Washington's teeth. And many of them are human teeth. Because what happened in those days is, and this is from one of Washington's journals, paid 6 pounds, 2 shillings to Negroes for 9 teeth on account of Dr. Lemoyne. What would happen is, your teeth would fall out. And you would go to a rich, this lady looks like she has a lot of money, so you would go to a rich lady like this and say, would you like to buy my teeth? No? Yes, you would. You put them in your denture. And that's what happened. So that his teeth were made of human teeth. They were made of lead, gold. They had springs, brass screws, ivory, and human teeth. But they were never made of wood. That's just another myth about George Washington. Now, there are many portraits of George Washington. Ready for this? He never wore a wig. Most men never wore wigs because wigs were uncomfortable. You wear a wig, it's not like today. You wear a wig in those days, how does it stick to your head? It falls down over your eyes, it goes crooked. So very few men actually wore wigs. Now, something neat about George, I bet you didn't know, he was a natural redhead. George Washington was a redhead. The picture that you see on the right is young George Washington, where he wanted to join the British Navy. And the woman is Mary Ball Washington. That's his mother, dissuading him from doing that. And here's some images from the ladies' collection at Washington's Mount Vernon. Here is Colonel Washington when he's in the British Army, and that's an actual lock of his hair taken by Martha Washington. So he was a redhead. So what did he do? He powdered his hair. Whoops. Let me go back a minute. He powdered his hair. And the only other redheaded president was Thomas Jefferson. He was also a redhead, and he also never wore a wig. He powdered his hair. So when you watch the TV shows, there's going to be 1,000 of them, and they're going to show you Washington with a wig and Jefferson with a wig. No, they never wore wigs. Not in reality, they powdered their red hair. Now, one other thing about our friend George. As opposed to me, he loved to drink. And I'm not talking about water. He was a real drinker. And he had a distillery at Mount Vernon. And in the back of the distillery, he distilled whiskey. And more than 11,000 gallons a year, Washington distilled whiskey at back of Mount Vernon. Now, I did have here something really cool. And this is Washington's recipe for eggnog. Now, when Christmas comes, you drink Wawa egg. This is not Wawa's eggnog. This is Washington. Honest to God, this is a real recipe. And it's a sugar quart, milk and whatever. 1 pint of brandy, half a pint of rye whiskey, half a pint of Jamaican rum, a quarter pint of sherry. Mix it, let it sit, and taste frequently. Isn't that cool? Yeah. George enjoyed his world, didn't he? That's all true. And the taste frequently is part of the recipe. Honest to God, I copied it right off. So he enjoyed his beverages. Now, George Washington, by the way, just as a little matter of information, his second inaugural address was the shortest ever. It was only 2 minutes long. His entire inaugural address is right there. I'm not going to read it to you. It's not that fascinating. But I just thought it was interesting that his second inauguration, he stood up and sat down. So it was only 2 minutes long. So now we're going to talk about the guy with the longest inaugural speech, and that is William Henry Harrison, our 9th president. Now, until recently, he was our oldest president. He was 68. And he gave the longest inaugural speech. Remember I said Washington's speech was 2 minutes? His was an hour and a half. 8,445 words. And remember something, there's no microphone. Right? There's no microphone. I said there's no microphone. So can you imagine standing there and this guy's talking away for an hour and a half. The longest speech ever. Now, when he left the podium, they said, Mr. President, we have a new invention, photography. And he is the first sitting president to be photographed. But you see, now what happened was he gave that speech on a rainy, miserable, cold day. He caught pneumonia and he died 33 days later. He gave the longest inaugural speech ever, and to this day has the shortest presidency, only 33 days. William Henry Harrison is the grandfather of our 23rd president, Benjamin Harrison. Now, Benjamin, this is a great story. He was president right at the end of the 19th century, and they installed electricity in the White House. Isn't that great? Except he was too scared to turn the light switches on. And he and his wife refused to touch the light switch. They'd walk around the White House, and there would be somebody following them, turning on and off the lights. They refused to turn on or off the lights. They wouldn't touch a light switch. It's amazing, these guys, right? All right, so when William Henry Harrison passes, then we get John Tyler. Now, he's really interesting. He's the first president to become president without being elected president, so they called him Your Excellency. Now, he was very busy. He had 2 wives and 15 children. He's the president with the most kids. He had 15 children with his 2 wives. Now, once he became president, he said, you ever watch the Mel Brooks movie, It's Good to Be the King? He said, it's good to be the president, and I will do whatever I want. And nobody could stand him. His own cabinet members hated him. So during the 4 years he's president, he has 3 secretaries of state, every year a new secretary of the Treasury, every year a new secretary of war, and 5 secretaries of the Navy. Nobody liked him. There, at the end of his term, they called him a poor, miserable, despised imbecile. And the most unpopular public man who's ever held any office of the United States. And in 1844, nobody would nominate him. They told him to just go away. Now, Tyler leaves the presidency, and right before the Civil War, imagine this one. He's the president who joins the Confederate Congress. So he became a Confederate congressman while he was previously president of the United States. He's the last of the old Southern antebellum presidents and the last president to own enslaved people. Now, this is John Quincy Adams. He is the son of John Adams, and he's our 7th president. Now, this is really an interesting little story. He won the famous Amistad slave ship case. He was a lawyer, and he was elected president, and he was also served in Congress. But I want to hear a great story. So he would go down from the White House to the Potomac, and in the morning he would take off his clothes, and he'd jump in the Potomac and go for a morning swim. Now remember, we didn't guard the president in those days. The president would just walk around, right? Well, John Quincy Adams hated newspaper reporters. He said, "You can ask me anything you want. I'm not telling you nothing. I'm not talking to you." So a young reporter went down to the Potomac, sat on his clothes. She took his clothes. And she said, "I won't give them back until you agree to speak to me." I think that's cute. And there she is. Her name is Anne Royal. She was a writer. And she forced him to respond to her questions before she gave him his clothes back. Now, people talk about Abe Lincoln, and that Abe Lincoln lived in a log cabin, was born in a log cabin. Well, that's not unusual because it's the frontier. And there's 7 presidents that were born in log cabins, not just Abe Lincoln. This is Abe with a bad hair day. I thought it was really cool. The newspaper said it's a thatch of wild Republican hair. Irregular flocks of thick and carelessly brushed hair across his face. Now, did you know he almost engaged in a duel? This is really quite a story. He was a congressman in those days, and he got in an argument with a guy named James Shields. They were both from Illinois. And they got into an argument. Now, in those days, all these arguments were printed in the paper. And all this stuff goes back and forth. And they called each other's names and all kinds of stuff. And finally, he wrote a satirical comment in the newspaper. And Lincoln writes about Shields, "His very features in the ecstatic agony of his soul spoke audibly and distinctly. 'Dear girls, it is distressing, but I cannot marry you all. Too well I know how much you suffer, but do remember it's not my fault that I'm so handsome and so interesting.'" Now, Shields was furious. And he goes to Lincoln and he says, "I'm fed up with your language. I challenge you to a duel." Now, dueling is illegal, but they do it anyway. And what this map shows you, a little island where I put that little arrow, that's called Bloody Island. Now, it doesn't exist anymore. It used to be in the Mississippi River, and that city is St. Louis, Missouri. So they went to Bloody Island. Now, Lincoln is pretty smart. So what does he do? He says, what do you usually duel with? Guns? Nah. What does he pick? He picks cavalry sabers. Now, these sabers are this long. They're like 3 feet. They're huge, heavy, unwieldy things, as you can see. Now, let me set the picture for you. Abe Lincoln's about 6'3". And as you know from seeing pictures of Lincoln, he's got real long arms, right? Now, Shields is about 5'7". He's about a normal height man at that era, and normal arms. But Lincoln's got this huge reach. And he picks sabers. And Shields is going, "Oh my God, I got to duel this guy?" So what does Lincoln do? They go out the next morning to the Bloody Island. And he takes this heavy cavalry saber and he sees a tree branch. And Lincoln goes, whew, and that tree branch flies right off. Now think of this. Little James Shields. He's going, ay, 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 ay. This isn't good. So he sends his seconds. They go to Lincoln's seconds. They say, look, bygones will be bygones. We'll shake hands. And the duel didn't happen. Now, Shields is an interesting guy in and of himself. Afterwards, he is the only senator to be elected at 3 different states. What happened was, I read about him. Well, first he became a general in the U.S. Army. He was such a horrible general in the Civil War, they told him, just please go home. They resign and go home. He went to the first state, he went to Illinois, where he was from. And he's really nice, like a pleasant guy. Hi, how are you? Vote for me. Once he got in office, I don't want to hear from you. I'm done, and he did what he wanted, and they wouldn't reelect him. So he moved to Minnesota and got elected there, and then they didn't want to reelect him, so then he moved to Missouri. So he's the only senator to be elected at 3 different states. They asked Lincoln later about the duel, and he said, I do not deny it. But if you desire my friendship, you will never mention it again. Now, let's put to rest. You've all heard this one. Lincoln is so sick. Oh, my God. He's got Marfan syndrome. He's got thyroid problems. He's got ingrown toenails. Who knows what he's got? Now, none of that is true. Lincoln was just tall for that era. As you can see, he was very tall. He had long arms. However, he was far from debilitated. Lincoln was a strong guy. Now, he loved to wrestle. As a young man, Harold Holzer, one of the preeminent Lincoln historians, writes, Lincoln ran, wrestled, and lifted heavy objects with the best of them. He was usually served as the end man in a tug of war. Now, one day, a young guy he was in his hometown of Salem. And you know how boys walk with their books like this, So this guy, Jack Armstrong, walks behind him, and he sees Lincoln. He goes, boom! And he shoots the books all over the lawn. And then he starts taunting Lincoln. Well, Lincoln picked him up and body slammed him. So Jack Armstrong shook it off, walked up to Lincoln and said, all right, we're friends. That's, and shook his hands just like that. Now, Lincoln thought, you know what? I can make some money. Remember, he didn't have a great deal of money. So he started wrestling at county fairs. And he almost won every match. In those days, you'd win $1 or 50 cents or whatever. And he wrestled for a number of years. And Harold Holzer writes again, an awesome physical specimen at 6'4", was widely known for his wrestling skills and had only one recorded defeat in a dozen years. Now, some of you are going to say to me, wait a minute, Herb, that doesn't make sense. Except, you ready? In 1992, he was elected to the Wrestling Hall of Fame. So he is the only president who's in the Wrestling Hall of Fame. If this comes up on Jeopardy, you guys are all going to win. I love the little t-shirt, by the way. Isn't that cool? Now, the other thing is, he worked on flat-bottom boats, and later on, before he became president, he is the only president to have a patent. Those things on the bottom where you see the tag, that's the original model. Those are floats. And he said, well, if you pump up the float, the boat will rise and it will float off the sandbar wherever it's stuck. Now, they never built it, but he's the only president to have a patent. And he's the only president to ever appear. Remember Popular Mechanics? Yeah, he's the only one to ever appear on that magazine because of his patent. Now, this is another myth about Lincoln. Lincoln wrote the Gettysburg Address sitting on a train riding to Gettysburg. They still tell the kids that in school, which is kind of ridiculous. Lincoln, again, he made a beautiful speech in 1854 where he set his political philosophy. And he made many speeches. And this, of course, is the famous Gettysburg Address. And people think, well, he sat on the train and wrote this. Well, it's utter nonsense. Now, also, there's the only picture we have of Lincoln at Gettysburg. Because it was such a short but magnificent address, he stood up and sat down before the camera could click. The man before him was Edward Everett. And Edward Everett spoke, ready for this one, for 2 hours. And Lincoln spoke for about 3 minutes and gave a magnificent speech. Now, much of what Lincoln says comes from the Declaration of Independence, because Lincoln knew the Constitution permitted slavery, and he was very much against slavery. And he says, I've never had a feeling politically that did not spring from the sentiments in the Declaration of Independence. And here you can see an earlier speech right after the Battle of Gettysburg. He wrote, how long is it? 80-odd years since the 4th of July, and for the first time in our history, and that becomes 77 years ago. Now, the 77 years ago refers to the Declaration of Independence, not the Constitution. Then later on, we see that he said in a speech, the world will not forget we say this. And that again shows up in the Gettysburg Address. Now, Lincoln also listened to other politicians, and this is Daniel Webster, and he says, the United States is a popular government, erected by the people, responsible to the people, and chosen by the people. And of course, the famous lines that then show up in the Gettysburg Address. Now, the trains in those days, this is awful. Do you know the trains had no springs? So you ever see the old movies? You know, the train would stop and it goes like this, you know, because it had no springs. So you're sitting there like this. And the windows are open, and the soot's flying in, and the dust is flying in, and Lincoln's sitting there, 77. No. It really just never happened. That's the original version of the Gettysburg Address. You can see how beautifully written it is. So Lincoln certainly was not sitting on the train. He probably had his head buried in his hands, suffering like everybody else. And then the last thing I want to talk about is Lincoln's secret love. Now, one thing many of you may not know about Abraham Lincoln, because there's so many attractive ladies here in this room, he loved the ladies. He did. He loved women. And he had numerous relationships. Now, the first one was Anne Rutledge. He was a young man, and he was very much in love with her. And tragically, she dies very, very young. And he writes, I did honestly and truly love the girl and think often of her now. And there's a picture, of course there's no photography then, but that's a depiction of what we think she looked like. And her resting place says, the original grave of Anne Mays Rutledge where Lincoln wept. And of course, then later on, a young woman named Mary Owens decided that she really wanted to marry Lincoln. So she started to visit him in Salem. And Lincoln wrote letters about her to a very close friend of his, Mrs. Eliza Browning. Now, remember, I want to go back a minute. This is Abraham Lincoln, "fourscore and 7 years ago," right? And all the magnificent language in his speeches. And he writes about Mary Owens, "I see no good objection to plodding through life with her hand in hand." Isn't that romantic? But it gets better. You see, then what happened, he didn't want to let her down. He didn't want to just say, Mary isn't going to work. So he started saying to her, and he moved to Springfield with his friend Joshua Speed, a lifelong friend of his. And he wrote to Mary Owens, who was still chasing him in Salem, and he would say to her, and we have the letters. The letters exist. As you can see, these letters actually exist. He said, you don't want to marry me. Life would be terrible. I'm a miserable person. You can't get along with me. And he was telling her that to try to keep her away. So finally, he writes this this is part of a long letter. And he tells her, you don't want to marry me. I'm a miserable guy. I'm really not very good. And he says, "If it suits you best not to answer this, farewell. A long life and merry one attend you." And Mary Owens never replied. Now, I'll finish up with a letter he writes to Mrs. Browning. Now, again, this is the great emancipator, right? This is Abraham Lincoln. Here's what he writes about Mary Owens to Mrs. Browning. "When I beheld her, I could not for my life avoid thinking of my mother, and this not from her withered features, for her skin was too full of fat to permit its contracting into wrinkles, but from her want of teeth, weather-beaten appearance in general, and a kind of notion that ran in my head that nothing could have commenced at the size of infancy and reached her present bulk in less than 35 or 40 years. In short, I was not at all pleased with her." So that is Mr. Lincoln. He was a real person like everybody else. There are many, many movies about Abe Lincoln. Some of them are very good, like the movie Lincoln and then Young Mr. Lincoln. And then, of course, there's Lincoln and the Zombies, and Lincoln the Vampire Slayer. And then, of course, this is an early movie. This is really interesting. This is D.W. Griffith's film, the first talking film of Abraham Lincoln, starring Walter Houston. This is really something they just found. They found an old film called The Heart of Lincoln, a little short movie which they think now is the oldest existing movie about Abe Lincoln. He appears in over 300 movies. Can't make a movie without Abe. And here are some of the movies that have been made about Mr. Lincoln. Some good, some not so good. And then, of course, he meets Captain Kirk in Star Trek. That's The Twilight Zone. And he even appears in South Park in 2007. So there you go. I'll mention Rutherford B. Hayes very, very quickly, and then I know my time's up. I got to stop. But this was the most contested election ever in 1872. And what happened was they started calling the president Rutherfraud and your fraudulency. And a little thing about him, he created the first White House Easter egg roll. You know how they have the eggs outside the White House? Well, Hayes did that. And the other thing is, while he was president, Alexander Graham Bell created the telephone. Wow! Well, who's going to get the first phone? The president. So they go to the president and they say, "Mr. President, here's this new invention, the telephone. There's only one problem. Who does he call?" So they installed it in his office and they gave him the telephone number of 1. That was it. So you ring, "Hello, give me 1." And he's the first president to speak on the telephone. So with that, I'm going to stop. Again, I do apologize. I've been driving forever, but I appreciate all of you waiting for me. I hope you found these little stories interesting. I hope you had a little fun with it. Also, I'd like to say to all the fathers in the room, Happy Father's Day. Of course, we were here last month, and again, Happy Mother's Day to all the moms. So thank you very much, and we will see you again, hopefully on time.